The rain pounded against the cracked pavement, turning the quiet street into a slick, glistening path of escape. Heavy boots splashed through puddles, chasing after a terrified black teenager. His breath came in sharp, desperate gasps as he sprinted through the darkened alleyways of Monroe County, Georgia. He had seen them coming, the headlights cutting through the storm, the siren that never wailed, because when they came for someone like him, they didn't make a scene. They didn't need to. The fear in his gut had told him to run before his mind could catch up. "Get back here, boy!" The voice was laced with pure hatred. The teen's shoes slipped on the wet ground, his heart hammering as he barely caught himself. His name was Isaiah Reynolds, just 16 years old. He had done nothing wrong, nothing but exist in the wrong town at the wrong time. Whoa. A few hours ago, he had been at the local store picking up bread for his mother. That's when he saw them, 3 white cops in crisp uniforms leaning against their patrol car, watching him like a pack of wolves sizing up prey. Isaiah had tried to ignore them, but his hands shook as he counted out his change. The cashier, an old white man, didn't even meet his eyes as he handed over the paper bag. The moment Isaiah stepped outside, the cops followed. He had seen enough in his 16 years to know what was coming. And so, he ran. But now, his body was failing him. The cold air burned his lungs, his legs ached. A gunshot cracked through the night. Isaiah flinched, nearly stumbling. They were done chasing. Now they were playing. He turned the corner sharply, but the street ahead was blocked. Another patrol car, headlights beaming like hungry eyes. A second later, the first cop tackled him to the ground. Isaiah screamed as his face smashed into the wet pavement. Rough hands grabbed his arms, twisting them behind his back with sickening force. "Look at the little criminal," one of them sneered, pressing his knee into Isaiah's back. "You think you can run from us?" A boot connected with his ribs, once, twice. The sharp pain stole his breath. His vision blurred as raindrops mixed with his tears. "Please." Another hit. His voice died in his throat. One of the officers, Sheriff Langley, crouched down beside him, the devil himself in uniform. Langley was in his 40s, a man whose cruelty was as famous as his badge. He had a smirk that promised nightmares and a voice that dripped with amusement when he spoke. "You people never learn." Isaiah tried to speak, but the words never came. The pain was too much. The rain kept falling, drowning out the sound of his shallow, gasping breaths. Across the street, hidden behind an old, tattered curtain, Elijah Carter watched in silence. His weathered hands gripped the edge of the window. His knuckles, dark and wrinkled with age, turned white. He had seen this before. Too many times. This town had buried his friends, his neighbors, his own kin, every single one stolen by men like Langley. And now another boy was being dragged into the night, into the system that never let go. Elijah's lips pressed into a thin line. His heart, though slowed with age, pounded with the same fire that had burned in him decades ago. He knew what came next. But this time he wasn't going to watch in silence. Elijah Carter sat in his dimly lit living room, the weight of 75 years pressing heavy on his bones. Outside, the storm still raged, but inside, the only sound was the slow creaking of his old wooden chair. He hadn't moved from his spot by the window. Not since he watched that boy, Isaiah Reynolds, get dragged away like an animal. Not since he saw Sheriff Langley's twisted grin under the streetlights. Elijah knew exactly where they were taking him. Langley's jail wasn't just a holding cell. It was a place where boys like Isaiah disappeared, where justice meant a lifetime behind bars for a crime that never happened. Or worse. He had lived in Monroe County his whole life. He had seen enough to know how this story ended. The same way it always had. He exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. His body was tired, his soul even more so. There was a time when he would have fought back, a time when he had hope. But that was decades ago, before the town took everything from him. Elijah was just 20 when he first learned what real fear was. He and his best friend, Benjamin "Benny" Tate, had been walking home after a long day at the steel mill, laughing, joking, full of dreams about leaving Monroe behind for something bigger. Then the truck pulled up beside them. 4 white men, rifles, cold, empty eyes. Benny was the louder of the two, the braver one. He refused to look away when they told him to lower his head. That's what got him killed. They strung him up on a tree by the river. Said he disrespected a white man. Elijah still remembered the way Benny's mother screamed when they found him the next morning, his body swinging like a forgotten shadow. No arrests, no trial. Just another black boy erased from history. A week later, Elijah's younger brother, David, was thrown in prison, falsely accused of stealing from a white-owned shop. The judge didn't even let David speak before sentencing him to 20 years. Elijah had fought. He had protested, marched, shouted, wrote letters. But it didn't matter. The system swallowed David whole, just like Benny. And one by one, Elijah's fire burned out. By the time he reached his 50s, he had given up. The world wasn't changing. The people in power weren't letting it. So he became like the others, just another old man watching from his window, keeping his head down, waiting for his turn to come. Until tonight. Until Isaiah Reynolds. A knock on the door snapped Elijah back to reality. He turned slowly, his stiff joints protesting as he rose to his feet. When he opened the door, his heart clenched. Isaiah's mother stood there, soaked from the rain, her eyes red and swollen. "They took my baby." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Please, Mr. Carter, they took my baby." Elijah had no words. What could he say? That he was sorry? That he understood? That he had seen this play out 100 times before? The woman's shoulders shook. A mother's grief, the kind that never heals. Elijah looked past her, down the street where the jailhouse loomed in the distance, its lights still burning through the rain. Something inside him snapped. He had sworn never to fight again, never to hope. But tonight, history wasn't just repeating itself. It was mocking him. And Elijah Carter was done watching. Elijah Carter wasn't a young man anymore, but his mind was as sharp as ever, and right now it was working fast. Sitting at his worn-out kitchen table, he spread out every scrap of paper, every name, every piece of information he had gathered. If he was going to take down Sheriff Langley, he needed proof. Something real, something solid. Not just stories, evidence. Elijah started knocking on doors, whispering in quiet corners of town. People knew what had happened to Isaiah Reynolds. They had seen the bruises, the blood on his shirt when he was dragged through the streets. But when Elijah asked them to testify, most just shook their heads. Fear was stronger than justice in Monroe County. "I got a family, Mr. Carter," one man muttered, eyes darting around like someone was watching. "I can't risk my job," another woman said, clutching her daughter's hand tightly. Elijah understood. He had lived under Langley's rule long enough to know what happened to people who spoke up. But he kept pushing, because if he didn't, Isaiah would never walk free. It didn't take long before Langley's men caught wind of what Elijah was doing. They started making their presence known. Cops showing up outside houses late at night, phone lines suddenly going dead, people disappearing for questioning and coming back with busted lips and swollen eyes. Elijah knew exactly what they were doing. The same thing they had done for years, silencing the truth before it could spread. One by one, The people he had spoken to started backing out. "I'm sorry, Mr. Carter," whispered a woman at church, eyes full of regret. "I can't help you." The sheriff wasn't just terrorizing Elijah. He was terrorizing the whole town. Just when Elijah thought he was running out of options, he found an unexpected ally. Her name was Margaret Evans, a white woman. She had been in town that night, driving home from her sister's house when she saw exactly what happened to Isaiah. She saw the cops chasing him down, tackling him, kicking him while he begged for mercy. She saw Sheriff Langley standing there, laughing while his men broke Isaiah's ribs. And she wasn't afraid to talk. "I won't stay silent," she told Elijah firmly. "I saw what they did. I'll testify." Elijah felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope? A white woman testifying against Langley? This could change everything. For the first time, it felt like he had a real shot at winning. But he had forgotten one thing. Sheriff Langley wasn't going to let that happen. The smell of smoke woke Elijah in the middle of the night. Not from his own home, but from the other side of town. He barely had time to throw on his coat before he heard the sirens. When he got there, Margaret's house was already gone. Nothing but ashes and charred wood, the glow of dying embers painting the sky orange. The fire department called it an accident, but Elijah knew better. The message was loud and clear. "Stay out of this, or next time it's you." Elijah Carter sat in his dimly lit kitchen, staring at the burned remains of a letter in his hand. The last letter he had sent to the local newspaper had come back unopened. No one wanted to hear the truth. Not the press, not the police department, not the so-called justice system that was built to protect men like Langley. Margaret Evans' house had been burned to the ground. Sheriff Langley had made it clear anyone who tried to fight back would pay the price. But Elijah had lived through worse. He had lost his best friend to a lynch mob. He had watched his brother rot away in prison for a crime he never committed. And now, he was too old to be afraid. If no one was coming to help, then he'd do it himself. Elijah spent every night writing letters. To journalists, to civil rights organizations, to state officials. He wrote until his hands ached, page after page, pleading, demanding, begging. Some letters never got a response. Others came back with the same cold answer. "We regret to inform you that we cannot interfere in local law enforcement matters." Elijah slammed his fist against the table in frustration. The whole system was built to protect men like Langley. No one was going to help. Until one day, someone did. The letter came in an unmarked envelope. Inside was a short note, handwritten in clean, precise letters. "I believe you, but we need more proof." At the bottom, a name was signed, Malcolm Hayes, NAACP, attorney. Elijah's heart pounded. The NAACP. Someone had finally listened, someone with power. A week later, Elijah met Malcolm Hayes in a small diner outside town. The young lawyer was sharp, confident, and full of fire. But he didn't offer false hope. "Your word alone won't be enough," Malcolm said, sipping his coffee. "We need real evidence, something we can take to court." Elijah exhaled slowly. "Margaret Evans saw everything," he said. "She was ready to testify." Malcolm set his cup down, voice calm but firm. "And now she's homeless," he said. "That wasn't an accident, Mr. Carter." Elijah nodded grimly. "I know." Malcolm leaned in. "If we're going to bring down a sheriff, we need proof that can't be ignored." He hesitated before adding, "Are you willing to do what it takes?" Elijah didn't even blink. "I survived Jim Crow, son," he said. "I've already done what it takes." Elijah was too old to fight with his fists. but he could fight with the truth. And now he had a plan. He got his hands on a small tape recorder, the kind reporters used. Then he went undercover. He walked into the town hall like he belonged there. Old men were invisible to people like Langley. No one gave him a second look as he shuffled into the records office, his tape recorder hidden in his pocket. He listened. He waited. And then he heard gold. 2 deputies laughing about how they planted a gun on Isaiah Reynolds. Click. The tape recorder caught every word. The next night, Elijah walked into a bar where off-duty officers drank. He bought a drink for Deputy Frank Glover, a man known for running his mouth. "Shame about that boy they locked up," Elijah said, voice casual. Frank snorted. "Dumb kid, thought he could outrun us." He took a long sip of beer. Langley wanted to teach him a lesson. Elijah leaned in. "What kind of lesson?" Frank grinned. "The kind that keeps people like you in their place." Click. The tape recorder whirred softly in Elijah's pocket. He had him. He had all of them.
Sheriff Langley was many things: a liar, a thug, a murderer. But he wasn't stupid. He knew when trouble was coming. And Elijah Carter was trouble. A nosy old man poking around where he didn't belong. Langley had seen men like him before, men who didn't know when to stop. So he decided to teach him, the way he always did. Elijah woke to the sound of shattering glass. Before he could react, the front door exploded off its hinges. Boots, voices, laughter. Deputies. Sheriff Langley's men. They swarmed his house like a pack of wolves, knocking over furniture, pulling drawers from their cabinets, looking for something. Then one of them spotted the tape recorder on his desk. Bobby Kent, a deputy with asterisk, mean eyes and a cruel smirk, picked it up and smashed it against the wall. "That's what you get for sticking your nose where it don't belong, old man." Elijah barely had time to move before the first punch landed. They didn't stop at breaking his things. They broke him too. Fists, boots, the cold steel of a baton cracking against ribs. Elijah hit the floor hard, pain exploding through his body. He barely heard the laughter, the threats, the casual way they talked about what would happen if he kept running his mouth. By the time they left, Elijah Carter lay in a pool of his own blood. But he wasn't broken. Not yet. Elijah woke up in a hospital bed. His ribs were cracked, his face swollen beyond recognition, one eye wouldn't open. Beside him, Malcolm Hayes sat with a grim expression. "You can't keep doing this," the young lawyer said, voice tight. "They nearly killed you. Next time they will." Elijah exhaled slowly, pain shooting through his ribs. "So what? I stop? Let them win?" Malcolm shook his head. "I'm saying this is bigger than you. And if you're gone, who's left to fight?" Elijah didn't answer. Because he knew Malcolm was right. But stopping wasn't an option. The next morning, a nurse walked in holding an envelope. It was addressed to him. Elijah took it with shaking hands, tore it open, and read. His breath caught. How? The case had reached the Supreme Court. After decades of suffering, after all the pain and loss, someone had finally listened. Someone was finally willing to fight. But then he read the next line, and his heart stopped. The judge assigned to his case was a man he once fought against during the Civil Rights Movement. Elijah Carter sat at the plaintiff's table, his hands trembling slightly, but not from fear, from anger, from years of waiting for this moment. Beside him, Malcolm Hayes adjusted his tie, his jaw tight. Across the aisle, Sheriff Langley sat smugly, flanked by his high-paid lawyers. The man had spent decades terrorizing black folks, breaking families, bending the law to his will. And now he was grinning, like he knew the outcome already, like he had already won. Then the judge entered, and Elijah's breath caught. Judge William Tate, the same man who decades ago had stood on courthouse steps, telling black protesters to go home. The same man who called the civil rights movement a disruption to the natural order. And now he held Elijah's fate in his hands. From the very start, the bias was clear. Judge Tate barely looked at Elijah or Malcolm. But when Langley's lawyer spoke, he nodded along, almost smirking. This case is built on speculation, one of Langley's attorneys argued. An elderly man's accusations, rumors, and hearsay, hardly enough to tarnish the reputation of a decorated sheriff. Malcolm stood up. Your Honor, we have more than accusations. We have hard evidence. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a stack of files. Tape recordings of Sheriff Langley ordering officers to falsify charges. Bank statements proving illegal payoffs. Survivors who were too afraid to speak. Until now, the courtroom shifted. Even some of Langley's supporters stiffened in their seats. For the first time, the sheriff's smirk faltered. Judge Tate leaned forward, tapping his gavel. I see no reason to pursue this matter further. The sheriff has served this community for years. Malcolm cut in. Your Honor, with all due respect, you haven't even reviewed the evidence. Tate's gaze turned cold. You would do well to watch your tone, son. Malcolm opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Elijah Carter stood up. Shaking, but powerful. I've been fighting for justice. Elijah's voice was hoarse but steady. Longer than you've been wearing that robe. The courtroom froze. Tate's eyes darkened. You're out of order, Mr. Carter. Elijah stepped forward. I know who you are, Judge Tate. I remember your face. You stood against us when we marched for voting rights. You called us troublemakers. You called us worse. Now you sit up there, pretending you're a fair man, pretending this is justice. Elijah pointed a trembling finger toward Langley. But we all know what this is. Langley's lawyer shifted uncomfortably. Somewhere in the crowd, someone whispered, he's right. Elijah turned, facing the entire courtroom. How many more black boys have to die before you decide we deserve justice? How many more mothers have to cry? How many more times will we be told to wait? His voice cracked. I am done waiting. The silence was deafening. And for the first time, Judge Tate looked uncertain. Tate glanced at the crowd, then at the stack of evidence. Then, finally, he sighed. The court will hear the evidence. Langley shot to his feet. Your Honor, this is ridiculous. I've served this town my whole life. Tate pounded the gavel. You'll serve it from a cell, Sheriff. Gasps. Whispers. The moment hit Langley like a bullet. The walls were closing in. And for the first time in his life, he couldn't do a damn thing about it. Days later, the jury delivered its verdict. Guilty. Sheriff Langley and his officers were arrested. Every charge, every crime, exposed for the world to see. Elijah Carter walked out of the courthouse, the sun warm on his bruised face. For the first time in decades, he felt free. But as he looked around, he saw something else. Young black boys watching him. Young men, young women. The next generation. And Elijah realized this wasn't just about his fight. It was about theirs. And maybe, just maybe, they wouldn't have to fight alone. Elijah Carter stepped out of the courthouse, the evening sun casting long shadows across the pavement. People gathered, whispering, watching. Some faces were filled with hope, others with hatred. Sheriff Langley, still in handcuffs, stood near a police van, his face twisted in rage. This ain't over, Carter, he hissed, his voice dripping with venom. You think a courtroom can change anything? Elijah met his eyes, steady, unwavering. It already has. Langley spat on the ground. You just signed your own death warrant, old man. The officers shoved him into the van, the doors slamming shut. As the vehicle drove away, Elijah took a deep breath. Justice had been served, but the war wasn't over. Back at his small wooden house, Elijah sat in his rocking chair, the weight of the day pressing down on him. The air was thick, humid, the kind of night where the heat clung to your skin. Crickets chirped, a dog barked in the distance. He sighed, rubbing his aching ribs. The bruises from Langley's men still hadn't fully healed. Inside, the radio played softly. A historic case today, as Sheriff Langley, once thought untouchable, was found guilty. Elijah barely heard it. His mind drifted to the past, to the marches, the protests, the friends he had buried. He had lived long enough to see a corrupt man fall. But at what cost? A car rolled down the street, its headlights off. Elijah's rocking chair creaked. He glanced toward the road, his grip tightening on the armrests. The car slowed, then stopped. A figure sat behind the wheel, watching. Elijah exhaled, slow and steady. He had felt this feeling before, a hunted feeling. His hand slid under the small table beside him, gripping the cold steel of his old revolver. The porch light flickered. Then a gunshot rang out. The rocking chair kept moving, back and forth,